So, thank you once again very much that you are part of our year's Sarajevo Fest. It's a great honor for us, and I think this will be a great conversation about a very important topic in today's world, and that's the pursuit of happiness and the meaning of happiness in our life, and how that is connected with the founding fathers of the United States, especially Thomas Jefferson. So you dedicated a great part of your life to studying the work of Thomas Jefferson. Why are you fascinated with that person?
Well, he's a very rich person to study. There are so many different ideas about Jefferson, and his works, the things that he's written, support all kinds of interpretations about happiness and other things as well. And of course, for the United States, Jefferson is an iconic figure as the author of the Declaration of Independence, which has been described as the political creed of the United States. Of course, the first great modern secular nation, but the idea of creed, or a set of beliefs that are fundamental to our collective pursuit of happiness. It all comes back to Jefferson. So he's attracted a lot of study and a lot of controversy and conflict. In a way, you can understand, I think, or begin to understand American history and modern world history if you engage with Jefferson.
Mm-hmm. In world history, Jefferson is probably the most popular for the sentence from the Declaration of Independence that every citizen has the right to life, liberty, and
Yes.
pursuit of happiness. We know all what life and freedom mean, but the dilemma is still, I think, what he meant by the pursuit of happiness. How do you see that?
Yeah. Well, we can only speculate, but I have some strong ideas, which I'll share with you. And first, the idea of happiness, even in Jefferson's writings, means different things. The obvious, immediate meaning for us today has to do with individual happiness. What that is still not clear, but Jefferson talks about happiness in various contexts. The tension in Jefferson's thinking about happiness and in the Declaration is between the individual and the community. Now, that may seem obvious and banal, but it's important to understand that the Declaration of Independence was drafted by Congress with Jefferson on the committee to draft it, and he was the lead draftsman. But it was drafted in the middle of a war, and what the Declaration did was to provide language and ideas for what they called the common cause. In other words, you could see it as a kind of recruitment device. That is, this is the way for us to understand what we're fighting for in what we call the American Revolution, which was really a civil war. The important thing to remember about the American Revolution and the revolutionaries is that they were rebels against legitimate authority. These were British colonies, provinces of the British Empire. The challenge for patriots was to justify doing something which was patently illegal. It was treason. It was rebellion against the legitimate sovereign. And the solution that the revolutionaries came up with worked in two ways. The solution was to imagine that sovereignty is only conditionally held by any sovereign, any king. Ultimately, it has to come from the people. They have to be the source of legitimate authority. And when we think about happiness in the Declaration, we should remember that that's the overriding purpose of the Declaration, is to bring into being a people that is a new corporate collective entity, a nation. That idea of a people who were not simply subjects of superior authority, subjects of a king, was a very revolutionary idea. That's the importance of the Declaration of Independence. So the point I want to make is that we think about happiness in very personal and subjective ways. But Jefferson and his colleagues were, of course, thinking about every individual potential American, but they were thinking also collectively about this new people that they were bringing into existence by the mere declaration. Americans become a people because they declare themselves to be a people. So it's in that context that he's enjoining people to pursue happiness. But what he's really calling on people in 1776, in the middle of this war, a war that Americans seem to be losing for many years, was sacrifice of individuals. This is the paradox, I think, that at the heart of happiness, the call for sacrifice from patriots, patriotic Americans who would put their lives on the line to win the war against George III and the British Empire. You can't have individual happiness, and this is the promise of the Declaration, that if we win this war and we vindicate our claims to be a people, then you will be able to pursue your happiness. I think the word that ties this all together occurs to me when I talk about this is mobilization. We think of happiness in very personal, individual, subjective terms, and we think of it often as a state of satisfaction or sufficiency. We got everything we need. What more can we want? Is that happiness? Well, Jefferson emphasizes pursuit. It's getting there that matters. We're pursuing happiness, and that pursuit begins on battlefields. Now, I'm dramatizing this to make a point, but this is a state of war that the Americans are in, and they're being asked to abjure their king, to deny allegiance to the king, and to enlist their efforts on behalf of this common Republican cause. That's what's so radical about the Declaration, and that's what makes the word happiness itself such a crucial but controversial term.
In the 17th century, John Locke created the concept of life, liberty, and property. But Jefferson didn't say life, liberty, and property, but life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Can you? How do you see that? Why not? Why not property? Why pursuit of happiness?
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful question, and it's at the center of any discussion of Jefferson. If it was property that you were defending, then that's a status quo. That is, I own these things. We're having a war so that I can continue to own these things. And of course, Americans were very acquisitive and enterprising. They wanted to gain independence individually as well as collectively. And Locke's ideas in context would say, in effect, we like the situation status quo ante bellum, before the war. Let's return to that moment. In that idea of pursuit is the germs of a larger Enlightenment notion of progress. That is, we go to something. Now, that pursuit includes, and for Jefferson, absolutely includes the acquisition of property. But the important thing in the United States, at least as Americans understood it, without showing much respect for Native peoples, indigenous peoples' claims to property, was that there was a vast reservoir, a reservation of land for enterprising Americans. In other words, property wasn't already fully distributed. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not some win, some lose. The promise of the pursuit of happiness is that everyone wins. Everyone, if you're sufficiently enterprising, wins. And the very idea of rights, think of it, it's almost circular. Rights come out historically, the idea of rights with Locke and other thinkers comes out of conceptions of property. That is, what's mine and not yours. You can't have a sense of self or individual rights unless that entails the ability to keep what you get legitimately. If you get it fairly, then it should be yours. None of the founders would argue with that. It doesn't mean, however, that owning property is the beginning of society, because you can't have property without law. You can't have stable claims to property unless you have a legal regime that is going to secure your rights. The idea of rule of law, of constitutional government, of course, are very British ideas. And these provincial Britons in America wanted to fulfill the dreams of British political philosophers, of ordinary Britons and Scots and Irish people who came to the US to own property and then to achieve for themselves some kind of independence. But you couldn't enjoy your property if you didn't have control over the government. And that's the whole issue of the revolution, is what Americans called taxation by the British Crown without representation. In other words, to own property, you have to own your government. That seems a kind of a syllogism, but there it is. It is a revolt of property-owning Americans. There's no question about it. But if we think of it in terms of pursuit, we're not thinking of property as a fixed distribution of rewards. We're not thinking, as I say, in zero-sum terms. If you were simply defending property rights and privileges as they had existed, you'd be defending inequality and hierarchy. The great challenge for the revolutionaries is to generate enthusiasm for the common cause by positing that all men are created equal, and all men are equal in the sense that they have the opportunity to acquire property. But there's not going to be no property if the Americans don't win their war. That's the predicate. And that's my point I'm making. It may seem circular, but if you don't win the war, you can't distribute property, you can't defend property. There's going to be no opportunity for the rising generation. If you lose the war, and this is where Jefferson and other patriots make some of their most tendentious and, we say, outrageous claims, if they don't have control over the distribution of property, the common domain, the public lands in their own polities, in their own provinces, then they will be reduced to the condition of their enslaved people. That is, the negation of property rights, the negation of all rights, is the condition of enslavement. And that's a very powerful idea, of course, to us now. And because Jefferson and others were slave owners, it seems outrageous for them to make this claim. It's incompatible with any notion of human rights and natural equality. But the main point here is that Jefferson understands that property does not exist in the state of nature. You can't have property if you don't have law. And what the Americans are accusing George III of is being a lawless despot by not acknowledging the rights of these overseas Britons, the rights of Englishmen, which Americans eventually claim are really the rights of all peoples. But here's the crucial thing. It's a people, it's the collective claims of the people, that is the existence of a people in a country that is land of their own. That's the beginning of the pursuit of happiness. But the pursuit of happiness itself is open-ended. Who knows where it's going to lead? We don't know what the world is going to be like. Jefferson couldn't possibly anticipate our world. So there's something profoundly progressive and enlightened by this idea. And many conservative thinkers in Britain and in America thought it was a ridiculous way to think, because without establishing and respecting established authority, then the result would necessarily be anarchy, the war of all against all. And if you looked at the American Revolution in 1776, you'd say, well, we have a civil war here. Often it divides families. It's an anarchic situation, or incipiently, emergently anarchic. And it would lead to this Hobbesian nightmare of total devastation. And what happens when you have never-ending war? These are the optimal conditions for the emergence of despotism. Americans are fighting against George III. They call him a despot. They're risking the possibility that they will create their own despotism. Because if you unstring the social order, if you destroy hierarchy, what's to keep people together? What's to make these pursuits harmonious? And I think here it's important to think, when we think about happiness, about Enlightenment notions of sociability. That is, we are naturally drawn to each other. If we did not have artificial distinctions, if we did not have privilege, if we didn't have people who were born to rule over everybody else, people would not be at war with each other. Their natural condition would be to be drawn to each other. Thomas Paine in Common Sense in 1776, the great revolutionary pamphlet, makes a distinction between society, which is natural. Society is the way people come together because to form families, to feed themselves, to sustain future generations. Society is natural. Government is a superimposition. Now, we think what republicanism is, and as Jefferson imagines it, is to take that dialectic of government, which is power, with standing armies, with the authority to adjudicate conflict, to take the potential despotic power and the idea of natural society and fuse them. Republican government is supposed to be the synthesis of power and liberty.
So in today's America, especially the conservatives see Thomas Jefferson as some kind of their hero and role model. But to what extent does the ideas of Thomas Jefferson still shape the political system of the USA, and how important is Thomas Jefferson in USA today?
I think he's very important, but often for the wrong reasons.
Excuse me, just you told me that his ideas for that period were radical, and it may be for some listeners in Europe that can sound a little bit ironical that he is today a hero of the conservatives in USA. So can you a little bit explain us to that? Yeah.
He's everybody's hero.
Yeah.
And that's precisely because he is such an iconic figure. If you can own Jefferson, if you can claim him, then that authorizes your politics, your position. And he has been appropriated by conservatives and property-loving conservatives, particularly. There is an element of Jefferson that they emphasize, which we call libertarian, which is a notion of individual sovereignty. Jefferson is insistent on the dangers of consolidated, concentrated authority. This is the mindset of patriots as they mobilize collectively against the king, is the fear of the overarching, the power of despotic monarchy. So, Jefferson believes that every citizen must be vigilant. That is, in effect, to conduct ongoing surveillance of those who would be their rulers. The Republican idea is that governors are servants of the people. You see, there are lots of paradoxes that are central to all these ideas, that somehow the people who rule are not superior to us. They're doing something for us. Jefferson makes this claim in 1774 in his famous pamphlet, The Summary View of the Rights of British America, in which he says kings are the servants of the people. He's enjoining, asking George III to understand that his role is to serve the public good, not to advance his own personal or dynastic interests, not to conquer other nations, not to be lord of the universe, of the world, but instead to serve the people. That's the powerful idea that's immanent in notions of limited or constitutional government, even with a monarch, is that governors, kings, are the servants. Now, the idea of equality, I think the real confusion is, if you look back on Jefferson, you look back on the founding period, and you are conservative in your inclination, you say you want to stop history. You want it to be just like then, now. Of course, Jefferson didn't think that there would be no change from then until now. He thought there'd be tremendous change. He was right about that. So that idea of fixing forever the property rights of those who own against those who don't. There's a fundamental tension in this idea of equality. If equality is not dynamic and progressive, it's not equality to participate as a citizen and in market relations. If you don't have that kind of equality, then you're the equivalent of a slave. But of course, property-loving libertarians emphasize the Jefferson who is suspicious of and opposed to strong government.
Jefferson is considered today a great man of American and world history. However, many, especially from the today American left, question his greatness as a person because of his private life, and they have the
Yeah.
biggest problem with the fact that he was a slave owner. So what
Yeah.
is the right way to look at Jefferson, and how do you see that paradox? I think that he is writing that all people are created equal and everyone has the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But on the other hand, he by himself is a slave owner, and those people don't have
Right.
any rights.
Right, absolutely. And I second that point. That's absolutely right. I understand why there is a turn against Jefferson. The idea of Jefferson as the first great American racist is now the way many people think about Jefferson. I think it's misguided. I don't think it helps us particularly. I would say the reason that Jefferson can chart out these ideas of equality, of government by consent, is that he imagines a world in which individuals come together as citizens. The problem, and as equal citizens, that's where equality means something. That's when you can talk about rights. That's when property can be accumulated. Enslaved people are not part of the civic community. They are owned by the enslavers, people like Thomas Jefferson. You say that's fundamentally unjust, and Jefferson would agree with you if you said that. I mean, he says, the best way I think to think about the relationship between slave owners, enslavers, and their slaves is a state of war, and Jefferson knew that. In other words, think of enslaved people as a nation in captivity, held in chains to work for, to give their, not to pursue their own happiness, but to work for Jefferson's happiness. That is a horrific idea to us. But the idea of warfare, I think, is crucial. And Jefferson says this: if there is a just God, that God could not take the side of the enslavers against the slaves. It's an unjust institution. Think of it this way: Jefferson imagines that he didn't ask to be born in Virginia. He was. He didn't ask to be a great slave owner. He was. That's what he was born into. And then ask the question, could he see beyond that? Could he imagine a world without slaves? Well, yes, he could. But here's what really is upsetting to, I think, modern Americans and anybody who studies Jefferson closely. He could not imagine that there could be peace between these two nations at war.
Yeah. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Jefferson's vision of the United States. Yeah. And there is an interesting thing between the battle between him and also a great founding father, John Adams. They had two concepts about what the United States should be organized. Adams wanted that America had to have a stronger federal government, to be more centralized, and Jefferson wanted something like a confederation between the U.S. states. Why Jefferson was someone who thought the confederation and very weak federal government is better than the Adams concept of the stronger and more centralized US government?
It's a good. Well, we usually say questions are always good questions, but I think your premises are wrong. And I'll suggest the problem is, and most Americans think this way too, that we structure our thinking about our own history in terms of big and small government, of minimal government, strong government, federal versus state. Federalism has been the framework within which we've thought about American history. The problem is that both Adams and Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, George Washington for that matter, grew up as Britons in the British Empire. And what all of them wanted until it was too late and it was impossible to get was an improved British Empire. If you frame their intentions in these terms, that is, they wanted to improve on the British Empire, according to 18th century commentators in Britain and in France and other places as well, was the most enlightened modern empire. It was the template, or it was the most progressive empire. That the natural course of empire, Bishop Berkeley said, was moving westward. That empire, it was an empire of liberty. That notion is associated with Jefferson, but it comes out of the British imperial experience. And this is one of the great paradoxes of American history. The American Revolution is against the British king and against the old regime. And it's very easy to identify all movements for national liberation based on great national difference. But the problem with the American Revolution is the Americans were British. And their revolution was on behalf of rights that they understood in British terms. And what they wanted was an empire that would continue to function in the way it had functioned so effectively in the 17th and 18th century, to bring so much territory under cultivation, to create such a prosperous empire. Adam Smith was astonished by British America and his Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. It was, and I talked about Jefferson imagining a Republican government as being an engine for moral progress. Republican government, decentralized government with a great deal of autonomy in the various provinces, was an engine for prosperity, for the prosperity of the British Empire. When the British sought to centralize authority and to deprive the legislatures in the provinces of their autonomy and lawmaking capacity and control over property, the British reformers, they thought they were going to reform the British Empire around the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. British reformers destroyed the goose that was laying golden eggs. This was the perception of American patriots. They did not want to be independent. So the question, I think, is, and there are lots of answers to this, it's not that leads to one obvious way of thinking about American politics, is that different thinkers have different conceptions of what would make an independent American empire prosperous and powerful. And there's no prosperity without power. This is another important thing. You can't have the pursuits of happiness, as I said, unless you've got stable markets, unless you have stable property, unless you have opportunities to trade abroad. And there's no point for these colonies in the 18th century if they don't produce something for European markets or West Indian markets. Americans of the 18th century are internationalists, they're cosmopolitan, their orientation is the larger world because they know they depend on overseas markets. They depend on British credit, and they will continue to depend on British credit and markets and overseas connections after independence. And in many ways, they won't be independent because they continue to rely on their connections in the Atlantic economy. So what I want to suggest is, rather than big or small, there are different ideas about what is needed to establish a powerful, more improved American empire on the British model, to make it better. One of the things you certainly needed was stable public credit, the capacity to make war, that is, to defend collective interests abroad, sustain union at home. In this respect, Hamilton and Washington have a clear sense of the importance of public credit. That is, taxation, the need. Americans, paradoxically, though they've fought a war against taxation, increased their taxation enormously because they had to service the debt from the Revolution. And they would continue to use public credit, both as an instrument of foreign policy, but to promote internal improvements, infrastructural development, and so forth. The idea that the United States was a little state, lightly governed, is simply ridiculous. It's not true. It existed as part of a global political economy, and under the Constitution, which did make an important fundamental change, and Jefferson agreed with that. He argued about the interpretation of the Constitution, but when Jefferson became president in 1801, his Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, followed the work of Hamilton, did not destroy the Hamiltonian system. The Hamiltonian system was the core of the American federal state. everything depended on having a collective security arrangement and the resources, the fiscal military state that could support American power and prosperity. So there are variations. Jefferson's genius was to see, and he was in many ways thinking back to the 18th century or before the Revolution. He had the genius to see that what made the empire work was an extraordinary degree of participation of provincial elites and ordinary people in their own government, an extraordinarily equitable and broad distribution of property. These were things, he said, this is what attaches people to their government. And that attachment is what makes the United States, as Jefferson put it in his inaugural address in March 1801, the strongest government on earth, because it has the support of the people who identify with it, who are attached to it, who think it's their government. So if you want to pass out credit or talk about who did what, it's not big versus little. It's not the libertarian versus the authoritarian Hamilton. It's working out a system which incorporates all of these elements. And Jefferson's as much a big government guy as Hamilton when it comes to the Louisiana Purchase, when it comes to making or fighting necessary defensive wars. Jefferson's ready to suspend civil liberties. He's ready to do what has to be done because the first law of nature, and they believe in natural rights and the first law of nature is self-preservation. And the self in this case is the United States, which is why the American Civil War, the collapse of that federal system, the war of the states against other states, North against South, was such a tragedy for Americans who cherished the idea of a more perfect union. Of course, we know why there was a war, and that was precisely because Jefferson nobody had a solution to the problem of a large number of enslaved people. And that's ultimately what destroyed the Union. That is the inability to find a solution. And I'd only suggest, in concluding that point about slavery, is that emancipation has never been the result of enlightened masters saying, we need to end this is bad. It's not that there haven't been enlightened masters. It's not that there haven't been benevolent whites who haven't, often evangelical Christians who feel that holding people in bondage is a sin. But what has led to emancipation is war and the opportunities that war has created for upsetting hierarchical orders, for giving enslaved people a chance to fight, to tip the balance. And that's precisely what Jefferson feared in the Declaration, servile insurrection. That is, you're not going to be able to keep these people in bondage forever. Their force will be irresistible. And the reason for that, the ultimate reason for that, is it's in the interests of other nations to foment those servile insurrections. That's the Achilles heel of a slave society. So, but I'm being contentious. I'm quarreling with you in saying that question about big and little really isn't historically the question we need to ask. Mm-hmm. And if you ask what's the importance of the United States in world history, I'd answer that it's imperial hegemonic power continentally and hemispherically and to some extent in the world. That's the big story. And so we look at the United States, we're thinking about, that's a place where people consume a lot. They're very happy. They got equality, there's opportunity. All of those things may be true. But the most important thing has to do with the fact that the United States has been a great power and empire. And that was the model, that was the inspiration. They came from the greatest and most powerful empire.
I wanted to ask you, where do you see the greatest threats for achieving the pursuit of happiness in today's world? And I think you told a lot about that, so you can continue.
What would be the best way to think about pursuits of happiness? Well, my answer would be...
Now, where do you see the greatest dangers for achieving the pursuit of happiness?
Yeah, I think the great danger, as I've suggested, is that happiness is understood in individual terms. It's understood in terms of bodily wants and needs, in terms of psychological well-being, in terms of protecting each individual from the world and finding a safe place, as we say. Happiness has to be pursued with a notion of the common good. And you say, well, that's a very glib and banal thing to say. What is the common good and who gets to define it? And we could spend the rest of the night arguing, and you'd convince me that we'll never get along. I'm exaggerating it now because we're having a nice talk. I think we could. I think there's always opportunity. In fact, any fears, and I've been expressing some of my own anxieties about the future of the world. Maybe that's just because I'm an old guy and my time is gone and I should wave you goodbye. But my fears, of course, are also my hopes. They're the same thing. That is, what I hope for and what I fear will be disappointed is there will be collective action on this planet, among the nations, among people across nations, well, to preserve the planet. I mean, Jefferson's key teaching, one that we haven't really talked about, is the notion of generational sovereignty, and that is every rising generation is like an independent nation. It's a radical idea. He expresses it in a famous letter to James Madison in 1789. The earth belongs to the living. And what does that mean in practice? How do we define that independent nation? Does it have boundaries? Can you define one generation from another? No. But the point is still valid, and it's an important one. All of us only have a few years on this planet. And if we have any hopes for us collectively, it's not for our families. It's not for people just like us. It's got to be for everybody. Because the commons now is the global commons. And if we don't have the capacity to do something to save it, then it really doesn't matter. Then it's pretty hopeless. Then it's just the kind of nightmare vision of the war of all against all that inspired Thomas Hobbes to invent the notion of Leviathan, a very powerful state. The only way to solve the problem, you might say, China today represents, communist China represents the kind of the modern, postmodern instantiation of the Leviathan. It will make you happy. That may be the final thing to take away from notions of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is something that not only do you make, but you make in collaboration with others. If happiness is instead a static condition, and you, with your power, can make me happy, well, then we could all do drugs all the time and listen to rock and roll, and that's the end of history. It's happiness as something that is not a condition that you can grab and keep. It's going to disappear. You're not going to be able to hold on to it. Happiness is a state, an active state of mind, of a progressive state of mind, and imagining out of your own time into another time, to imagine that there will be people one day, not you, maybe not even your children, but somebody's children. And they're like you in fundamental ways. And you would hope that all the things that you failed to do, they might do better. That's, again, naive and maybe hopeless. But I think that's what we need to exploit. That's what we need to find in ourselves, is a sense of that, of a happiness that transcends ourselves.
Thank you very much for the great talk. It was a great pleasure for me, and I think you helped us better understand the Jefferson's concept of pursuit of happiness. And I think in today's world, it's also very important, especially now when we see the rise of some undemocratic regimes and ideologies, to keep in mind what are the values that created in America,
Right.
and what should be followed even in today's world as, I think, a role model of how to be a prosperous, rich, and free country. So,
Yes. Well, good luck to us and good luck to you. Thank you very much.
Have a nice day. Thank you. Goodbye.